We'll probably have a couple more still trickling in. We don't have a handout this week. If you see a handout on the table, it's probably from last week's class. It'll still benefit you in this class. We're still talking about the same stuff. We didn't finish going through that, but we are studying the book of Galatians. I'm kidding. It's Ephesians. Just making sure you're awake. Making sure we're all awake here. We are in the book of Ephesians, and we have been for a couple of weeks now. And Chris just asked me, he said, are we ever going to get to the verses? He didn't say it that way, but that we will get to the text. But I feel like a lot of times we jump into the text with not a great picture of the overarching theme of the book. A lot of times we just jump into verse 1 and we just start going, and we break it down into all these little pieces, but never really get the gist of the book. And so at least that's been my experience. And so I like to spend some time building some groundwork before we jump into the text. Let's look at some of these major themes that run through the book that hold the whole thing together. Every New Testament letter had a particular purpose it was written for, every one of them. And it's our job as readers of these letters to identify those threads that run through these that hold the whole letter together, that determine what is this letter really all about. One of them that's very easy to identify in the book of 1 Corinthians, the book is all about the division that had really just torn the church in Corinth apart. And so he writes and addresses the unity they're supposed to have and addresses the division and how to fix it in specific areas of the congregation. And so I like to do that with books before we just jump right in. I like to take some time and say, okay, what is really the heart and soul of the book of Ephesians? What is this book all about? Why was it written, and what is it trying to teach us? And I believe in tracing some of these themes and looking at the way it's organized can help us to do that. Now, as I said in the first class, the only way to really do that is to read the letter. There's no handbook that's going to tell you exactly what it's all about, and I'm sure you could find a book that could help, but the best way to get to know a letter is to read the letter over and over again. And what I'm sharing with you in these first several classes is here's what I've found as I've read through this letter, just from start to finish multiple times, some major themes that emerge from this letter and the structure of this letter and how it's all held together. And hopefully as we identify what those are, it can help us lay some groundwork for how to approach this book when we start going in chapter 1, verse 1, and just working through the book. We can see how it all fits together. And so that's kind of what we're doing here in these first couple of classes. Who remembers what the structure of this book is like? Anybody? How's this book organized?
First 3 chapters is our story. Is the gospel story, and then the last 3 are our story.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got 6 chapters in the book, and it breaks down perfectly. So the first 3 chapters are all about the gospel story. In fact, it's all pretty much just information, not really live this way and don't live this way in the first chapter. In fact, there's only one command in the first 3 chapters, and it's remember. And he's telling them to remember this gospel story. Remember all of this that you've bought into, that you've given your life over to. If I can remember right, this one's not working. Oh, it is. Okay. Just a second. Let me try this again. There we go. Bada boom. All right. Let's try that now. There we go. All right. So in this book, this is exactly how the book breaks down right here. You've got the first 3 chapters that tell this gospel story, and it uses that word, the mystery, over and over. We looked at that last time as one of the themes that runs through this book. Who remembers what the mystery is? Anybody? We talked about it at pretty good length last week. Yeah. In chapter 3, verse 6, he says, to be specific, here's what the mystery is. It's that Gentiles are now fellow heirs in the body of Christ. And why it's called a mystery is, for ages, that message has been hidden of how God was going to do that. People saw all of these great promises of the Old Testament. You think about Genesis 3:15 when there was the promise made to the serpent that there was going to come somebody from the lineage of Eve and he was going to crush that serpent's head. That is the most vague promise in the world. Can you imagine being a Jew and reading that thinking, what in the world is that all about? Well, that was a mystery. It was hard to understand. And we know on this side of Christ that was a look towards Jesus and what he was going to do in his final conquering act over evil. Other promises throughout the Old Testament were all vague and veiled a little bit. In fact, Paul uses that language of it being veiled, but the veil is lifted in Christ. When you view those Old Testament promises through Christ, the veil is lifted, and so it's called the mystery. But what it reveals is that there is a gospel message that brings people of all nations into a body of people. And the first 3 chapters of Ephesians lay out the nuts and bolts of that gospel story. And then in chapter 4, verse 1, you have that little word, therefore. That word, therefore, is the turning point in the entire book. It's where Paul switches from talking about, here's the gospel story, and here is what that message is all about. Then he says, therefore. Now, what does therefore mean? What does that tell you? Well, what's it there for? I had a preacher tell me one time, you always got to ask, what's the therefore? It's looking back at everything he just talked about and saying, therefore, because of everything I've just told you, here's what that means. And starting after that, he goes in a series of telling them how they ought to live based on all of this information in the first 3 chapters. And he talks about their walk with Christ. Over and over and over, we're going to see that running through the second half of this book. And so the first 3 chapters are marked by this mystery. It's defined and described. There's only one command in those first 3 chapters. In the second 3 chapters, you get instructions on how to walk. And there are 43 commands in the last 3 chapters of this book. And it's telling us, hey, here's how this ought to change how you live. Here's how the gospel should impact the way that you live your life on a regular basis. Does the gospel change the way you live at all? It ought to, shouldn't it? The fact that God has gone through such great lengths to save us and to bring us into this body of people and to draw us out of darkness and into light. All of the things that God has gone through since the beginning of time to get us back ought to change and impact the way that we live our lives. That's what the book of Ephesians is all about. It's laying out that gospel story and saying, here's how it ought to impact your life. We talked a lot about the setting of this book. Paul, an apostle, he is the author of the book. We talked a little bit about the audience, and if you notice, we looked at this variant in the first 2 verses there and talked about that at length. We're not going to rehash all of it, but it was likely not a very specific letter written to address specific needs of the church in Ephesus, but rather a general letter that circulated all of these churches. And it was started in Ephesus, it was passed on to Laodicea, and then passed on to Colossae, and it circulated around all of these churches, teaching them these fundamental truths about Christianity. When we fast forward, we've already looked at all this. The mystery, we talked about that last week, one of the main themes of the book. Unity is another main theme of this book that we've already talked about, the uniting of Jew and Gentile in one body. This is where we left off last week, talking about spiritual warfare. The book of Ephesians talks at length about spiritual warfare. Now, when we say spiritual warfare, what are we talking about? What comes to your mind when I say spiritual warfare? Yeah, this battle against the devil. That's exactly right. And Paul's actually going to talk about that very specifically throughout this book. And the devil is not working alone. The devil, in fact, I think it was Peter who talked about the devil and his angels. He has spiritual beings that work with him that are trying to tear apart God's plan. And in fact, let's turn, before we jump into this, hold your finger in Ephesians and turn to Revelation chapter 12, because you see a really clear portrayal of this. Now, understand the book of Revelation uses a lot of symbolic language. It talks about a lot of things that sometimes are hard to wrap your head around, but I think you can piece some things together in Revelation 12 that tell a story for us. In Revelation chapter 12, it lays out essentially the story of the Bible in one chapter. And it lays out this picture from the beginning. Follow along with me starting in verse 1. It says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, and a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth." This is a picture. You can take my word for it or not, but I'm going to just say it, but this is a picture of the nation of Israel preparing to give birth to the Messiah who was going to come. It's an image that's supposed to convey that to us. If you keep reading in verse 3, it paints the other side. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. This is an image of this spiritual warfare, and it pictures this great red dragon standing before a woman about to give birth, and he wants to devour the child. This is a picture of the devil standing before the nation of Israel as they're about to bring the Messiah into the world. And he says, I want to devour that child. And in verse 5 it says, and she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that she would be nourished for 1,260 days. So it says this child was born and he was caught up to heaven. And the devil couldn't destroy the child. It's a picture of the resurrection of Jesus. Well, if you go down and you look at verse 9, it tells us who the dragon is. In verse 9, it says, and the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So we see this picture. Satan has lost this battle against God's people and against the Messiah that was to come. And he's thrown down from heaven, and his angels are thrown down with him. And in verse 10 it says, now then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And in verse 11 it says, and they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. I love those passages there. They paint a picture of how Christians were to escape this devil who was fighting against him. It was through the blood of the Lamb and through the word of their testimony, their willingness to stand up for Jesus. And they didn't love their life even when they were faced with death. Now, notice verse 12, because in this picture of this spiritual warfare of the Bible between God and his people and Jesus and the people of God, Satan has lost. He has missed his chance to destroy the Messiah, and he's upset about it. So look at verse 12. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing he only has a short time. That's a scary verse, isn't it? To think that the devil has been thrown down to this earth, and he is angry, and he is upset because he knows he only has a short time. Short time to do what? To get us, right? To take us away from God's great plan that's been enacted in this whole world. He only has a short time to rip us out of God's hands, and he's angry, and he's upset. And if you skip down to verse 17, notice what it says. So the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Now we get specific. We know exactly who the devil is after. You know, a lot of times we think the devil is getting all those people in the world and he's tearing them apart and he's doing all these things. Sorry, the devil doesn't care about them. He cares about us. He cares about you and I, and he's angry and he's upset that God has won us back, that God has conquered him and God has brought us back into his family. And now he's angry and he's upset and he's trying to rip us out of God's hands. This is what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual warfare. There is a spiritual battle that's going on in the world around us that we can't see happening. Do you remember the Old Testament story where the prophet Elisha prayed to God and said, open our eyes so we can see? Do you remember what he saw? Anybody remember that Old Testament story? When the armies had surrounded. Let's read it really quick. Turn to 2 Kings chapter 6. In 2 Kings chapter 6, we see a glimmer of the things that go on in the world around us. 2 Kings chapter 6. And notice verse 15 and following. 2 Kings chapter 6. And let me get a volunteer. Let's read verse 15 through 17. 15 through 17. Let's get somebody to read that for me. Mark, you got it. You looked at me.
He said, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are Then Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." So the Lord opened the eyes of a young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha.
All right, so these armies have surrounded them, and they're scared to death. In verse 15, it says, what are we going to do? There's armies and horses and chariots circling the city. What are we going to do about this? And in verse 16, Elisha answered, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And I can imagine that guy scratching his head thinking, what in the world is this guy talking about? We are severely outnumbered. Like we are going to die in this war. And then in verse 17, Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see." He says, open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. It paints this beautiful picture of God's armies, His spiritual armies that we can't see, that are storming over the hilltops to fight this spiritual warfare against all of the enemies that seek to tear apart God's people. It's a really cool picture of that. And so he opens his eyes and he's able to see what's going on. Can you imagine if our eyes were opened to see all of the things happening in this world, to see the evil forces, the spiritual forces that are fighting to tear us apart? Can you imagine if we could see all of God's armies that are fighting on our behalf? And so we see this interesting picture here of that. But this is what we're talking about when we talk about spiritual warfare. And if you turn back to the book of Ephesians, Paul talks about this spiritual warfare in great detail in the book of Ephesians. In fact, the book of Ephesians talks about it probably more than any other of Paul's letters. You see, we've got a lot of references on the screen, and this is all of them that are very specific, but there's a lot more that are not specific, that are kind of allusions to those ideas that I don't even have listed here. But first of all, look at Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 20 and 21. The very beginning of this book, Paul lays out this beautiful praise to God, this poetic praise to God of everything that God has done and the beauty that Christians have in that, the blessings there are to be in Christ and to be a part of this great plan that God has enacted. Well, at the end of this chapter, Paul prays and says, I pray, God, that you can enlighten the eyes of their hearts so they can understand all of these things and understand the great lengths to which you've gone to save them and understand the riches of the glory of everything that they have. Well, in verse 20, Paul says something within that context that reveals a little bit about this spiritual warfare. Look at verse 20 and 21, and Chris, read that for me.
"This is the same mighty power that raised Christ from the dead and seated him in the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. Now he is far above any ruler or authority or power or leader or anything else, not only in this world, but also in the world to come."
All right, so he says this great power that has raised Christ from the dead, it has seated him at God's right hand where? Where does it say? In the heavenly places, in the heavens. This is not on earth. Jesus is not reigning on some throne on earth, but it's a heavenly throne where he's been seated at the right hand of God. And in verse 21, he says, he's in this throne, he's seated far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. Now, we need to understand a little bit of something about the language Paul uses. I'm curious, I want your input. We live in the South somewhat. We have sayings in the South, don't we? This was something that I didn't really think a lot about until we went to school in Denver, and people in Denver don't understand a lot of sayings in the South sometimes. Or we had a guy from Mongolia that we were in school with at Bear Valley, and some people that came from the South would say some things, and he would just look at them like, "What in the world are you talking about?" I've got a list of a couple of these that are interesting. You ever heard the phrase, "that dog will hunt"? Yeah. Well, you say that to a guy from Mongolia, he's like, "What in the world are you talking about? What dog are you talking about? We don't have any dogs here." You think of phrases like "over yonder." You know, we had a teacher in school that said that often. Guys from Mongolia doesn't know what that means. What is a yonder and where is it? And yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let me see. "Madder than a wet hen." You know, you think of things like that, and you can logically think about it and picture it, but sometimes some of those sayings are hard to wrap your head around. Can y'all think of any others that we have?
Not necessarily from like overseas, but when my parents used to live in Hawaii, they didn't understand the phrase "fixin' to."
Yeah, I'm fixing to. What are you fixing? What's broke? yeah, that's one I say all the time. But yeah, that's another one. Any others you can think of? Yeah. Yeah, what are britches? Yeah. What's that? Yeah. See, and we could go on for hours, couldn't we? We have some saying. I've got a list of probably 40 of them here that you could just work through and think about. But the thing is, sometimes there is language that we use that is foreign to other people. And we use phrases and words that sometimes don't mean the same thing to another group of people. Well, Bible writers do the same thing. And sometimes I think we strip the Bible of that way of thinking, but they had words and phrases that they used to convey a specific thing. Now, Paul was very particular about some words and phrases. In fact, this idea of rulers and authorities and principalities and powers, if you look at Paul and the way he uses those phrases like he did in Ephesians 1, verse 21, he said, Christ has been placed far above all rule and authority and power and dominion. Those words are all a way of Paul describing these spiritual forces of the world, these spiritual evil forces. Now, let me prove it to you. Turn to Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. And by the way, in my study, and there may be more that I'm missing, the only time Paul doesn't use these words in that way is in Titus chapter 3, verse 1. But every other time Paul uses these words, it seems like he's using them in that context of spiritual warfare. Look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10. And notice what Paul says. He says, finally, be strong in the Lord and the strength of His might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be stand firm against the schemes of who? The devil. So here's that. We're talking about the devil and his angels and the enemies. Now look at verse 12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against who? The rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. You notice how Paul uses those words to describe spiritual evil in the world? Almost every occurrence of these seems to be a reference to those. We could look at a lot more, and we'll look at a couple more in Ephesians and a couple of other passages, but Ephesians 6 kind of shows us how Paul uses that language of the rulers and authorities and principalities and powers in other translations. And when Paul refers to these, he's referring to the supernatural realm, the realm that we don't see but is there. And he's using these phrases to describe those demonic, dark forces of evil who are fighting against God's plan in Christ. We read about that in Revelation 12 and how Satan is fighting against those. Well, Satan's not working by himself, but he has all of these spiritual dark forces fighting to rip us out of God's hands. And that's how he uses that language. We'll look at a couple of other passages, but any comments, questions about that so far? Yep.
You had mentioned earlier, Satan is not after the world. Satan has the world.
Yeah.
The spiritual warfare is with God's people.
That's right.
Not with the
It is a war between God and His people and between Satan and his spiritual forces, these rulers and authorities and dominions and that language he uses. He's trying to rip us out of God's hands. I think Revelation 12 paints that picture for us, among other passages. But yeah, any other comments, thoughts? All right, let's look at a few others. Now come back to Ephesians 1 with this kind of idea in mind of this spiritual rulers and authorities and powers and dominions. And understand what Paul is saying in Ephesians 1, 20 and 21. He says, Christ has been raised and seated at the right hand of God in the heavenly places in verse 20. And in verse 21, he says he's been seated far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and every name that is named, not only in this age, but in the one to come. That phrase, name that is named, is an interesting phrase. It was used in regards to idolatry. They would name the name of Baal when they worshiped him. They would name the name of the Ashtaroth when they worshiped this idol. Or you think about the Philistines. They named the name of Dagon in their idol temple. They named their name. That's a phrase of describing this worship of these idols. And he says, Christ has been named above and seated above every name that is named. There is no demonic idol that people can worship that is above Christ. Christ has been seated above all of these spiritual forces. Now look at Ephesians chapter 2. In Ephesians 2, we get another picture. Ephesians 2, the first couple of verses. Starting in verse 1, it says, "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience." Let's hold on for a second there. Does any translation word that differently in verse 2? Specifically, the prince of the power of the air? Oh, there you go. Now we're getting crazy. All right. Any others? The ruler? Yeah. That's what I'm talking about. That's a very, very detailed depiction of it. But literally, the idea here is talking about the ruler of the power of the air who works disobedience in people. And he says, you as Christians formerly walked according to his ways. This is a picture of the devil. This is a picture of Satan, the prince of the power of the air, the ruler of this unseen world. He says, you formerly walked according to the course of this world and according to the prince of the power of the air and of that spirit that works in the sons of disobedience. In verse 3, he says, among them we too all formerly lived in the lust of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh of the mind. And we were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. And then he goes on in verse 4, but God, being rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, he made us alive together with Christ. And by grace you have been saved. And you've been raised up with him and seated us with him in the heavenly places with Christ Jesus. So you see, this picture that's painted in those first 6 verses is that we used to walk according to the ways of spiritual evil in the world. He used to have us in his grips. He used to have us. He didn't have to fight. He had us in his grips. But then he says, but God, being rich in mercy because of his great love, when we were dead, when we were walking according to that way, he made us alive with Christ. He ripped us out of his hands and brought us into Christ. And it says in verse 6 that in this process, he raised us up with him, that's Christ, and he seated us with him in the heavenly places with Christ. You see, we have a spiritual authority, if you will. We've been raised up and seated with Christ in the heavenly places because we're Christians. So just as Christ has been seated far above all of the spiritual evil, so have we as Christians. Christ has saved us from that world, and he's ripped us out of his hands, and he's seated us up higher than all of these beings. Do you see how he lays out that case here? By saying in chapter 1, Christ has been seated above them, and you also have been seated with him in the heavenly places. Any comments, thoughts about any of that? Yeah, go ahead, brother.
Just to give an image to exactly what you're talking about is Acts chapter 7 with Stephen.
Yeah.
And when Stephen says in verse 56, and said, behold, I see the heavens open, the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.
Yep.
Not only sitting,
Yeah.
but standing at the right
Yep.
hand of God.
Yep.
And also, who's holding the coats there? Who's writing Ephesians?
Yep, that's right. So yeah, it's very interesting. You see cases within scriptures where 2 Kings chapter 6 said they'd open their eyes to see these things. In Acts 7, when Stephen was being stoned, it said the heavens were opened and he could see these things. You think about the many visions that people had. John and the great vision of the throne room scene that he had, or Ezekiel in Ezekiel chapter 1, the great vision that he had of the heavens. These are very real things that the Bible describes often, and we play a part in that. A lot of times we don't really think in spiritual terms in a lot of ways. We don't think about spiritual evil in the world a lot. We think about evil, and when we think evil, we think in terms of governments and this side of the aisle and this side of the aisle and those people who are pushing this agenda. And we think in terms of people. But Paul thought in terms of the spiritual forces that were at work in the world. And he said those people are the ones, those spiritual forces are the ones trying to rip you out of God's hands. And so the picture painted in these opening chapters is, first of all, Christ is seated high above that spiritual evil, but also you as a Christian have been seated with him in the heavens. You've been raised up above spiritual evil. Now look at Ephesians chapter 3. In Ephesians chapter 3, he paints the first several verses of Ephesians 3 are some of my favorite in the Bible because he paints a picture of what this mystery of Christ is all about. And he talks about how it was hidden in ages past, but now it's been revealed and it's been brought to fruition. And Gentiles are now fellow heirs and members of the body. That's Ephesians 3, verse 6. And then Paul starts talking about how he was appointed to reveal this mystery to the world and to preach this mystery. And in verse 10, let's back up to verse 8 and notice what Paul says. He says, "To me, the very least of all the saints, this grace was given, to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of Christ, and to bring to light what is the administration of this mystery, which for ages has been hidden in God who created all things, so that the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known through the church to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly places." Now remember, how does Paul use those words, the rulers and authorities? He even specifies here that these aren't rulers and authorities on earth, but in the heavenly places. And he says that these spiritual forces, through his preaching and revealing of this mystery and through Gentiles being saved, he says now the manifold wisdom of God is seen in what? In verse 10. The church. It is through the church, the body of Christ, that is multi-ethnic and people from all nations and all backgrounds who once walked differently but have now been brought into Christ. He says now all of those spiritual evil forces who have been trying to tear apart God's plan forever, he says now they can see God's ultimate wisdom in the church. Remember last week we talked about it in 1 Corinthians 2 that if these evil forces knew God's plan, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. 1 Corinthians 2:7, Paul talked about that. If all of these spiritual forces of evil, if they knew that crucifying Jesus would have been their death sentence, they would have never done it. But that's why it was a mystery. It was concealed for all of those ages. And Paul says, but now, through my preaching, I'm revealing this mystery. And now all of the spiritual evil in the world can understand God's wisdom. All of those evil forces can see God's wisdom through the church. Now this is a cool thought to me, that you and I, as a body of people, are almost a slap in the face to the spiritual evil in the world, saying, look how good our God is. Look at all of the great things that He's done to bring us to where we are. And it's almost like a na-na-na-boo-boo kind of thing, you know? Like, you guys missed it. You guys thought you could steal us away. You guys thought you could win us over. You guys thought that you could conquer us. But we've got a great God who hid this plan for all of these ages, and now it's been brought about. And we are saved from your grips. We have been delivered from the evil forces of the world. You see that spiritual side of the gospel message? A lot of times we talk about the gospel in terms of the benefits we get, the salvation and the forgiveness of sins and the being reconciled to God. And that's a good thing to talk about. But we're also being delivered from evil. We're being pulled out of the evil forces of the world. In Colossians chapter 1, Paul talked about it. You've been rescued from the domain of darkness and brought into the kingdom of His beloved Son. A lot of times I don't know that we think about that we've been pulled out of the clutches of evil in the world and brought into the light. And Paul is saying that through the church, all of that wisdom that God used to orchestrate this plan is now revealed to those evil forces. And they can see how God orchestrated this whole thing. Any comments, thoughts about any of that? All right, let's look at a couple of other passages. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4. When he starts, this is a small note here, but in Ephesians 4:17, he starts talking to them about the way they walk, about how they're going to live. It's how the gospel message should impact the way they live. And starting in verse 17, almost all the way through into chapter 6, he addresses different things. You used to walk this way, but now you walk this way. You used to live this way, but now you live this way. And he goes on for almost 2 whole chapters that way. But in chapter 4, verse 26, notice what he says about this change of life that we should have. In verse 26, he says, "Be angry, yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give" who an opportunity? The devil. You see, Paul saw our walk as Christians as a way of saying, I'm not going back to that. I'm not letting them grab me again. I'm not going to give the devil an opportunity to take over my soul again. Look at Ephesians 5, verse 8. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8. He uses this little phrase. He says, "For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. So walk as children of light." He doesn't use any of the specific spiritual warfare phrases there, but he talks about you were once in this darkness, in this spiritual world of darkness. But now you've been brought into the light. Therefore, walk as a child of light. You see how that first half of the book is influencing this second. Go ahead, Chris.
Some people like to read about the spiritual warfare as if we are like pawns, and that we have no free will, and that would go against God's sovereignty or go against this spiritual warfare. But I think that these verses are pointing out like that's a choice that we make.
Yeah.
We turn towards that.
Yeah, I read a book one time about idolatry and modern applications of idolatry. And it was really interesting. What was the name of that book? I can't think of it to save my life. I don't remember either. Yeah, I can't think of it. But it was a good book. But his modern applications of idolatry were really, really well organized. But his whole thing was, and Ezekiel talks about this, and he kind of builds his book on that. When Ezekiel confronted idolatry among the people of Israel while they were in captivity, he told them, he said, "You guys have set up idols in your hearts." He didn't say you've set them up in your homes. He didn't say you set them up in your synagogues or in your temples. Now, they had done those things. But what his concern was, he said, you've set them up in your heart. And he builds this book off of that thought that every person who ever walks into idolatry has set up an idol in their heart. And he paints this picture of spiritual warfare as every single day, your heart is a battleground. Every morning when you wake up, every moment of every day, your heart is a battleground. And the devil and his angels are fighting to win your heart. And God and Jesus and the forces of good are fighting to win your heart. And the only person who gets to decide who wins is you. You are the one who decides who wins that battle of your heart. You get to choose who sets up shop in your heart and reigns over your life. And Paul is addressing that in this book. He's talking about, listen, there is spiritual warfare going on. And he goes into the second half and he says, you have to make the right choices. You have to walk as children of light. You have to live as children of light, understanding that you have been bought and you've been seated with Christ. And He is the one who has conquered your heart. So don't let anybody else in. And that's kind of the point of all of this. I don't know where we were going with that, but just to speak to your point, yeah, free will. We have the choice of who wins our heart every day. See your hand up?
If we keep reading right here, I mean, the next thing he says is don't participate in the darkness. I mean,
Yeah.
You've got a choice.
That's right. Every person has a choice. They can crack the door and let the devil in. Everybody has that option. And a lot of times, in all reality, we do that, don't we? A lot of times we open that door up and say, come on in and take a seat at my table. It's tragic, it is. But every moment we have the choice to kick him out. Every moment we have the choice to push him out the door and say, no, Jesus has conquered my life, and He is the one who sits at my table. And so we have those options. Did you find the book? I saw you make the face. God's at War. That's it, yeah. A book called God's at War. Written. He's a denominational preacher, but it's a well-done book. But yeah, God's at War. Let's look at the key passage to all of this at Ephesians chapter 6. And I find it very compelling that Paul wraps up the entire book this way. This is his grand conclusion to the book. And it's as if he's painting this picture through every page of the book that, listen, this whole gospel has been a spiritual victory for you. And the second half is, don't give up that victory. Don't walk away and go back to the darkness. And he ends with this grand conclusion in Ephesians 6, verse 10. And notice what he says. It's a famous passage. We know this one. He says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Put on the full armor of God so that you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. He tells them, listen, our warfare is not with the people out there. I don't care what a Democrat or a Republican does. I don't care what the president does. Your war is not with them. I don't care what anybody does out there. Your war is not with anybody outside of there. It is a spiritual war. Our war as Christians is with the spiritual evil of the world and the ones who are trying to rip you out of God's hands. And you know what? Sometimes those spiritual forces are going to use politics to do it. They're going to use this president or that president, and they're going to try to convince you to start yelling at people and to start mistreating people and to change the way you act, and they're trying to rip you out of God's hands. And sadly, a lot of people have walked right into the trap. They've walked right into it thinking they're making a great stand for good while tearing down the very people that are made in the image of God and doing the devil's work in the world. A lot of times we walk right into the devil's trap. Our war is not with people. Our war is with the spiritual evil of the world, and that's Paul's point here. And what's his solution? He goes on in the following verses. Take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm and resist in the evil day, having done everything to stand firm. And he goes on and he talks about all of the armor that we're to put on. And if you notice all of the things he says to put on, it's not anything you can do, really. These are all God's workings. They're all God's things and God's armor that you put on to fight a spiritual battle. But Paul's point at the end of this is, listen, we are in a spiritual war. We have enemies we're fighting against who are trying to rip us out of God's hands. And this book is a way of showing that to Christians, showing you've been bought with a price and you've been pushed into the light and brought out of the darkness. Therefore, stay in the light. Don't go back to the darkness. We've rescued you from that, so don't go back to it. We looked at this definition already. One of the other themes that we're going to see in this book is how you walk. We've looked at all these verses already, really, most of them. In Ephesians 2, he told them, you formerly walked this way according to the course of the world. In verse 2, you formerly walked according to the course of this world. And he tells them, listen, you used to walk this way. In chapter 4, verse 1, he tells them, therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you've been called. Boy, that's a great calling, isn't it? To think of all the great things God has done, the spiritual victory we've obtained. And he says, you need to walk worthy of all that God has done to win you. Chapter 4, verse 17, he says, so this I say to affirm together with the Lord, that you walk no longer as the Gentiles walk in the futility of their mind, but rather he's going to go on and list, not this way, but this way, not this way, but this way. And he goes through this long list of things. Chapter 5, verse 1, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for you as an offering and a sacrifice to God. He tells them to walk in love. In chapter 5, verse 8, he says, you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Therefore walk as children of light. Look at chapter 5, verse 15. Chapter 5, verse 15. Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time because the days are evil. You notice how Paul uses this theme of walking too, to say, listen, God has saved you. He's brought you out of the darkness. Let that change your walk with Christ. Let that influence how you're going to live in the days moving forward. So these are the themes of the book of Ephesians. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll jump into the text next week. The message of Ephesians can be summarized with all of these themes we've looked at. We've talked about the mystery. We've talked about the unity. We've talked about the spiritual warfare. And we've talked about how we walk. Those are some of the main threads that hold this book together. And so when we think about the message of Ephesians, this is it right here. The mystery of Christ, the gospel, tells of a spiritual victory that unites people of all nations in Christ. And that spiritual victory ought to change how we walk in this world. That is what this book is all about. That is what the core of the message of the book of Ephesians is going to be all about. Now, what I want to do in the coming weeks is we're going to work through this. It'll be in a somewhat verse-by-verse way, but we're going to move pretty quickly through it. There's not a lot of grand, deep concepts we need to hash out in every single verse. We've already hashed out a lot of the deeper concepts, and so we can kind of walk through this book and see how Paul makes his case for this argument. So we'll start that next week. Any comments or thoughts before we wrap it up? All right, that's all we've got. We'll see you next week. Hey.
Are you preaching today? 'Cause I think I